Pascal tells us that, from the perspective of facts, good and evil are merely a matter of latitude. And indeed, a specific human act is called a crime here, and a good deed there, and vice versa. For instance, in Europe, it is customary to tenderly care for one's elderly parents. Yet, in certain tribes of America, they are persuaded to climb a tree, which is then shaken. If they fall, the sacred duty of every good son is, as it once was among the Messenians, to finish them off immediately with precise blows of a tomahawk in order to spare them the burdens of senility. If, however, they find the strength to cling to a branch, it means they are still fit for hunting or fishing, and thus their immolation is postponed. Another example. The peoples of the North love to drink wine, that radiant stream where the dear sun sleeps. Our national religion even instructs us that good wine gladdens the heart. To the Mahometan neighbor in the South, this same fact is regarded as a grave offense. In Sparta, theft was practiced and honored. It was a sacred institution, an indispensable addition to the education of any serious Lacedaemonian. From this, undoubtedly, came the Greeks. In Lapland, a father of a family considers it an honor for his daughter to be the object of every courtesy a traveler admitted to his hearth can offer. In Bessarabia, it is the same. In northern Persia and among the tribes of Kabul, who live in ancient tombs, if you receive a hospitable and cordial welcome in some comfortable sepulchre, and yet, within 24 hours, you are not on the most intimate terms with all the offspring of your host, be they Gibra, Parsi, or Wahhabite, there is every reason to expect your head will simply be torn off, a punishment quite in vogue in those climates. Consequently, actions are indifferent so long as they are merely physical acts. The conscience of each individual alone makes them good or evil. The mysterious point lying at the heart of this immense misunderstanding is that innate necessity of man to create distinctions and scruples for himself, to forbid one action rather than another, according to which wind of his country has blown this or that idea upon him. One might say, finally, that all of humanity has forgotten and is trying to remember, groping in the dark, some lost law. A few years ago, there flourished, the pride of our boulevards, a certain vast and brightly lit café, situated almost opposite one of our genre theaters, whose fronton resembles that of a pagan temple. There, the elite of those young people gathered daily who have since distinguished themselves either by their artistic talent, their incompetence, or their behavior during the troubled days we have passed through. Among the latter, there were even some who held the reins of the state. As you can see, it was no small beer that one found in this café of the 1001 Nights. The Parisian bourgeois spoke of this pandemonium only in hushed tones. Often, the city prefect would carelessly toss in, like a visiting card, a choice bunch, an unexpected bouquet of policemen. These men, with that distracted and smiling air that distinguishes them, would then playfully brush the dust from mischievous and rebellious heads with the tips of their truncheons. It was an attention that, while delicate, was nonetheless felt. By the next day, not a trace of it remained. On the terrace, between the row of carriages and the glass windows, a lawn of women, a flowering of chignons straight from the sketches of Constantine Guise, dressed in unbelievable outfits, lounged on chairs beside wrought iron tables painted in the green of hope. At these tables, beverages were served. Their eyes resembled those of a hawk or a bird of prey. Some held a large bouquet on their knees, others a small dog, and others nothing at all. One would have said they were waiting for someone. Among these young women, two stood out for their diligence. The regulars of the famous establishment called them, simply, Olympe and Henriette. These two arrived at twilight, settled into a well-lit corner, ordered, more for the sake of appearance than actual need, a small glass of Vespetro or a Mazagran, and then watched the passers-by with a meticulous eye. And these were the Bienfilâtre Sisters. Their parents, honest folk raised in the school of misfortune, had not had the means to let them taste the joys of learning a trade. The work of this austere couple consisted mainly of hanging, at every moment and with desperate gestures, from the long cord connected to the lock of a carriage entrance. A hard trade, and altogether, barely and sparsely, a few pennies for bread. Never had a winning ticket come their way in the lottery. Therefore, Bienfilâtre would grumble as he prepared his burnt sugar in the morning. Olympe and Henriette, as pious daughters, realized early on that they had to intervene. Becoming sisters of joy from their tenderest childhood, they devoted the price of their vigils and their labor to maintaining a modest, true, but honorable level of comfort in their lodge. God blesses our efforts, they would sometimes say, for they had been instilled with good principles, and sooner or later, an early education based on solid foundations bears fruit. When people worried whether their labors, sometimes excessive, were affecting their health, they would answer evasively with that sweet and embarrassed air of modesty and with downcast eyes. Their graces of one station. The Bienfilâtre sisters were, as they say, of those workers who go to their shift under the cover of night. They performed, as worthily as possible, given certain social prejudices, an ungrateful and often grueling task. They were not among those idle ones who brand the holy calices of labor as something shameful, and they did not blush for their trade at all. Stories were told of them full of such nobility that the ashes of the philanthropist Montaigne must have shuddered in his magnificent cenotaph. One evening, for example, they outdid themselves in competitive zeal to pay for a dignified burial for an elderly uncle. Yet this relative had bequeathed them nothing but memories of various slaps and blows that had been distributed to them in the days of their childhood. Consequently, they were viewed with a favorable eye by all the regulars of that estimable establishment, among whom were people who did not compromise on their standards. A friendly nod or a wave of the hand always met their gaze and their smile. No one had ever addressed a single reproach or complaint to them. Everyone recognized that their manner was gentle and affable. In short, they owed nothing to anyone, honored all their commitments, and could, therefore, hold their heads high. As exemplary figures, they set aside savings for unforeseen circumstances for a rainy day, so that they might one day retire honorably from business. Being steady young women, they did not work on Sundays. Like wise daughters, they did not lend an ear to the talk of young gallants, who were only good for leading young girls away from the rigid path of duty and labor. They believed that in this day and age, only the moon is free in matters of love. Their motto was celerity, security, discretion, and on their business cards, they added specialties. But then one day, the younger sister, Olympe, went astray. Until then irreproachable, this unfortunate child listened to the temptations to which she was exposed more than others, who will perhaps judge her too quickly by the environment where her occupation forced her to live. In short, she made a mistake. She fell in love. This was her first mistake. But who has ever measured the abyss into which a first false step can drag us? A young student, candid, handsome, endowed with an artistic and passionate soul, but poor his job. One named Maxime, whose family name we shall suppress, spoke sweet words to her and led her into trouble. He inspired a celestial passion in this poor child who, given her position, had no more right to feel it than Eve had to eat the divine fruit of the tree of life. From that day on, all her duties were forgotten. Everything went into disorder and disarray. When a girl has love in her head, all discipline is lost. And her sister, alas, that noble Henriette, who was now literally bending under the burden of cares. At times, she would take her head in her hands, doubting everything: family, principles, society itself. "They are only words," she would exclaim. One day, she had met Olympe dressed in a simple black dress, with her hair loose and a small tin bowl in her hand. Henriette, passing by without pretending to recognize her, had whispered very softly, "Sister, your conduct is unspeakable. Respect at least appearances." Perhaps, by these words, she hoped for a return to virtue. All was in vain. Henriette felt that Olympe was lost. She blushed and passed on. The fact is that there had been gossip in the honorable establishment. In the evening, when Henriette arrived alone, the welcome was no longer the same. There is, after all, a sense of collective responsibility. She noticed certain humiliating nuances. People showed her more coldness since the news of the transgression of Olympe. Proud, she smiled like the young Spartan whose chest was being torn by a fox. But in her sensitive and upright heart, all these blows hit their mark. For a truly delicate nature, a trifle often does more harm than a gross insult. And in this regard, Henriette possessed the sensitivity of a mimosa plant. Oh, how she must have suffered! And oh, how it was in the evenings during the family supper. The father and the mother, with their heads bowed, ate in total silence. Not a word was spoken of the absent one. At dessert, when the liqueur was served, Henriette and her mother, after exchanging a stealthy glance and wiping away a respective tear, would share a silent squeeze of the hand under the table. And the old porter, his spirit out of tune, would then pull the doorbell cord without motive, simply to hide his rising tears. Sometimes, abruptly and turning his head away, he would bring his hand to his buttonhole as if to tear off some imaginary decorations. Once, he even attempted to recover his daughter. Gloomy, he took it upon himself to climb the several flights of stairs to the young man's dwelling. There he sobbed, "I desire my poor child." "Sir," Maxime replied, "I love her, and I beg you to grant me her hand." "Wretch!" Bienfilâtre had exclaimed as he fled, revolted by such cynicism. Henriette had drunk the cup to the dregs. One last attempt remained. She resigned herself to risking everything, even scandal. One evening, she learned that the deplorable Olympe was to come to the café to settle an old, small debt. She warned her family, and together they headed toward the brightly lit café. Like Melonia, dishonored by Tiberius, and presenting herself before the Roman Senate to accuse her violator before stabbing herself in despair, Henriette entered the hall of the austere. The father and the mother, out of dignity, remained at the door. Coffee was being taken. At the sight of Henriette, the countenances of those present grew heavy with a certain severity. But when it became clear that she wished to speak, the long newspaper rods were lowered onto the marble tables, and a religious silence fell. It was time to judge. In a corner, shameful and making herself almost invisible, one could distinguish Olympe and her little black dress at a small, isolated table. Henriette spoke. During her speech, through the glass, one could see the anxious Bienfilâtre parents, who watched without hearing. At last, the father could not contain himself. He cracked open the door and, leaning in with his ear on the watch and his hand on the doorknob, he listened. Fragments of phrases reached him as Henriette raised her voice slightly. One owed it to one's fellow beings. Such conduct, it was setting all serious people against her. A rascal who does not give her a single penny. A good-for-nothing. The ostracism that weighed upon her. To clear her responsibility. A girl who has thrown her cap over the windmills. Who gapes at the crows. Who, only recently, held a high position. She hoped that the voice of these gentlemen, more authoritative than her own, that the advice of their enlightened experience would bring her back to saner and more practical ideas. One is not on this earth to enjoy oneself. She implored them to intervene. She had appealed to childhood memories, to the voice of blood. All had been in vain. Nothing vibrated within her anymore. A lost girl, and what an aberration! Alas! At that moment, the father entered the honorable hall, stooped. At the sight of unmerited misfortune, everyone rose. There are certain sorrows that one does not seek to console. Each man came, in silence, to shake the hand of the worthy old man, to discreetly testify to the part they took in his misfortune. Olympe withdrew, shameful and pale. She had hesitated for a moment, feeling guilty, to throw herself into the arms of family and friendship, which are always open to repentance. But passion had carried the day. A first love throws deep roots into the heart that stifle even the seeds of previous sentiments. However, the scandal had a fatal resonance within the organism of Olympe. Her conscience, tormented, revolted. Fever took her the next day. She took to her bed. She was dying of shame, literally. The moral was killing the physical. The blade was wearing out the scabbard. Lying in her little room and feeling the approach of death, she called out. Some kind neighboring souls brought her a minister of heaven. One of them made the remark that Olympe was weak and needed to take some nourishment. A maid brought her a bowl of broth. The priest appeared. The old ecclesiastic strove to calm her with words of peace, oblivion, and mercy. I had a lover, Olympe murmured, thus accusing herself of her dishonor. She omitted all the peccadillos, the murmurs, and the impatiences of her life. That, alone, came to her mind. It was an obsession. A lover, for pleasure, without earning anything. Therein lay the crime. She did not want to attenuate her fault by speaking of her previous life, which until then had always been pure and full of self-abnegation. She felt clearly that there she was irreproachable. But this shame, under which she was succumbing, of having faithfully kept her love for a young man without position and who, following the exact and vengeful expression of her sister, did not give her a single penny. Henriette, who had never failed, appeared to her as if in a halo of glory. She felt condemned and dreaded the thunderbolts of the supreme judge, with whom she might find herself face to face at any moment. The ecclesiastic, accustomed to all human miseries, attributed to delirium certain points that seemed inexplicable to him, even diffuse, in the confession of Olympe. There was, perhaps, a misunderstanding there. Certain expressions of the poor child had made the priest pensive 2 or 3 times. But since repentance and remorse were the only points with which he had to occupy himself, the detail of the fault mattered little. The good will of the penitent and her sincere sorrow were sufficient. At the moment, therefore, when he was about to raise his hand to absolve her, the door opened loudly. It was Maxime, splendid, looking happy and radiant, his hand full of several coins and 3 or 4 gold Napoleons that he was making dance and jingle triumphantly. His family had relented on the occasion of his examinations. It was for his enrollment fees. Olympe, without first noticing this significant extenuating circumstance, stretched out her arms toward him with horror. Maxime stopped, stupefied by this scene. "Courage, my child," murmured the priest, who thought he saw, in the movement of Olympe, a definitive farewell to the object of a guilty and immodest joy. In reality, it was only the crime of this young man that she was repelling, and this crime was that of not being serious. But at the moment when the august pardon descended upon her, a celestial smile illuminated her innocent features. The priest thought that she felt herself saved, and that obscure seraphic visions were appearing to her through the mortal shadows of the final hour. Olympe, indeed, had just vaguely seen the pieces of sacred metal shining between the transfigured fingers of Maxime. It was only then that she felt the salutary effects of supreme mercies. A veil was torn. It was a miracle. By this evident sign, she saw herself forgiven from above and redeemed. Dazzled, her conscience at peace, she closed her eyelids as if to collect herself before opening her wings toward the infinite blues. Then her lips parted, and her last breath escaped like the perfume of a lily, murmuring these words of hope: "He has paid.